Buenos días a todos. Buenos días. Bienvenidos a esta charla muy interesante que estamos muy orgullosos de tener acá. Entonces, voy a arrancar un poquito en español y después paso a inglés. Entonces, lo primero que quería hacer era agradecerle a la Fuerza Aérea Colombiana, al teniente Quintero, teniente Poveda y teniente Mayarino Velandia por esta oportunidad, y les agradecemos a ustedes y a toda la Fuerza Aérea pues, por estar acá. Hemos estado haciendo varias cosas interesantes últimamente con la Fuerza Aérea, tenemos proyectos en conjunto, tenemos también algunos estudiantes de la Fuerza Aérea que están acá acompañándonos a nosotros acá en la universidad, y pues queremos que esta relación siga para adelante. Entonces hoy tenemos un visitante o unos visitantes bastante especiales. So I'm going to switch to English now. So we have today the honor of having here Coronel Hopkins and Coronel McDowell and Coronel Whitaker and Major Serna. So we're very honored to have you here. So I guess for many of us, space is something that is so far away, but it's food for dreams and food for ideas. And I guess for many of us, when we were like locked in rooms in 2020, watching the same 20 square meters or whatever. So at some point, there was a very interesting YouTube live transmission about the space missions and the new crew capsule and all those things that were happening. And it was, at least for me and my girlfriend and my family, I was talking a lot with my brothers, my brother and my sister at that moment. And we were watching live the thing from different parts of the planet, and it was super cool. And it was, again, like food for dreams and imagination. So I think the space and space exploration is one of those things that show us that humans, we can do very amazing things when we decide to work together in that idea. And I hope that here in the university, but also in the Air Force here in Colombia, and in the Air Force and the Space Force now in the States, we will continue to work all together as a whole group to create very interesting things. So here I'm very honored to present to you Mr. Major Hopkins. No, Coronel, sorry. Okay, Coronel Hopkins. So please welcome him. He will give a presentation now. Afterwards, there will be questions from you as well. If you want to make the question in Spanish, that's okay. We will translate for him. Okay. So thank you all for coming. Thank you for coming.
Good morning. So this morning I want to take you on a journey to the International Space Station. But before I do that, I want to share just a few stories. And the story I'm first going to start off with, do I have a clicker to change the slides? Or are we just going to do it here? Can you go through there? So we get work the slides. Okay, let's go to this second set right there. Perfect. Okay. I do a lot of outreach, talk to a lot of students, and we get asked a lot of questions. And one of the questions we often get asked about is, were you afraid? You're scared when you were on your space missions. And it's interesting because the answer is yes. I wouldn't necessarily think that, right? We're astronauts, we're strong, we're exploring the solar system. But the reality is there are moments that will get your attention, that will scare you. And so I want to share one of those moments with you, because I want to try and bring a little bit of the human aspect of going up into space. It's not all just the engineering and the science. There is a human piece to it. And so this is of 2014. So this was my first mission to the International Space Station. I've been on board for about, I would say 2 months at this point. And we had a failure with our cooling system. And our cooling system on the external part of the station. And so we needed to replace what's called a pump module. This pump module is about the size of a refrigerator, weighs about 400 kilograms. And so this is the pump module right here. And that's me holding onto that pump module. And I'm actually on the end of a robotic arm. This robotic arm is about 20 meters long or so. So each segment 2 meters. It's very much like your arm. And I'm attached to this robotic arm by a foot plate right here. And so the way this foot plate has a couple of toes. And you got your toes and then you push your heels out. And that kind of locks you onto this foot plate. So here I am on the robotic arm. I'm the lowest thing on station. There's nothing between me and the floor. And it's swinging me up in position so that we can move that pump module into its location. So the arms come up and it stops. This is a 20-meter long arm, and it starts flexing and oscillating like this when it stops. In that 400-kilogram pump module, it wants to keep going in the direction that it was going because it has mass. Even though it doesn't weigh anything, it still has mass, it still wants to keep going. And so when the arm's doing this, the pump module's doing that, and so it's pulling me up. And I felt like I had come off the arm. I felt like I was floating away with an 800-pound or 400-kilogram pump module. So that lasted for about 3 or 4 seconds, where it was that kind of sheer terror that I thought this was it, that I was done. Fortunately, after about 3 or 4 seconds, it evened out and it stabilized, and I realized I wasn't floating away, and my heart kind of went back down into my chest and my throat, and I realized everything was okay. The funny part about that story is now I should be ready for it, right? So they had to move me again to get the arm in the right orientation, and I kid you not, as soon as it stopped, it did all that again, and I had the same feeling again that I was coming right off that arm, even though at that point I still did. I knew to anticipate that.
Sorry.
You want to change?
Yeah, no. So one of these is out of battery. So if you
Oh,
can put
okay.
it here.
Oh man, I got all kinds of things on me. Okay. All right. So let's go to the next slide. So now that was in 2013, and now it's 7 years later, and I'm getting ready to go off on my second mission. And so I've been selected at this point as the commander of the SpaceX Crew Dragon Crew 1 mission. And so that was quite an honor. This was the first time that an engineer had been given command of one of our launch and landing vehicles. So previously, it had always been a pilot. If you go all the way back to Mercury and Gemini and Apollo, and then the space shuttle, the commander of those vehicles was always a pilot. So for the first time with these new vehicles, doors were opening, and it didn't just have to be a pilot in command. And so I was very fortunate and was able to command the vehicle. But this guy right here, Victor Glover, Commander Victor Glover, so he's now captain in the Navy, F-18 test pilot. And so sitting right next to me was that pilot, and I would not have wanted to flown in space without him right next to me. There is definitely a certain skill set that pilots develop over the years, in particular with just how to handle emergencies and things in a time-sensitive manner. And so it was great having him right next to me. And a couple things about him as well. Victor he played football in college. I played football in college as well, American football, not soccer. And he also has 4 daughters. And so while we were up in space on this last mission, his oldest daughter was going through the process of selecting a college, a university. And it was kind of fun listening to him, trying to help her out while he was orbiting the Earth with all of that. Dr. Shannon Walker, she has a PhD in physics. This was her second mission. I should also
Victor, this was his first flight. Dr. Shannon Walker, though, PhD physics, second mission, and she actually, kind of interesting, she's married to an astronaut, and she actually comes from an aviation family. Both her mother and her grandmother were pilots and worked in the aviation. And particularly for her grandmother, if you think about it, that was not very common for women to be in aviation back in that time frame. So for her, she comes from a long line of aviators, if you will. And then the last person I want to mention is Dr. Soichi Noguchi, the fourth member of our crew. He's from Japan. This was his, I think it may have been his fourth flight or third flight. A couple things interesting about Soichi as well. He, Victor and I played football in college, and when Soichi got assigned to the crew, we learned that he also played football in college in Japan. And I didn't even realize that they had that in Japan. But the other interesting thing about Soichi, when we launched into space, he became the third person in the history of human spaceflight. And in the history of human spaceflight, there's been about 650 or so people that have gone into space. And so when he launched, he became only the third person that had gone into space on 3 different vehicles. So the first person was Wally Schirra, who had gone up on the Mercury, Gemini, and Apollo program. And then John Young, who in the US is kind of a legend from the astronaut standpoint. He flew both Gemini, Apollo, and then the space shuttle. And then it was Soichi Noguchi was the third person then that had gone into space 3 times. So I was sitting next to an amazing crew. You can see what it looks like inside Crew Dragon. Definitely a more modern vehicle than what I flew on the first time. I flew on the Soyuz. And then this is the vehicle itself sitting on top of the Falcon 9 rocket. And so that's right after liftoff. So let's take a look at what it takes to get to that point of liftoff. So let's go ahead and click go back. Yeah, and we'll click on the video. We got some video here. What you're going to see at the beginning, this is our training on the ground that we do. It's a mock-up of the space station. And one of the important things we do there is emergency training as a crew. So they'll actually pump smoke in, for example, and we have to respond like it's a fire. The next thing you're going to see is training that we do under the water. And so that's this neutral buoyancy lab, and this is where we train for our spacewalks. I think it's important to note all of the divers. So there's 2 of us in the suits, but we have about 10 divers that are in the water with us the whole time while we're doing that training. We also get to fly in T-38s. It's the one thing we do that's real. So this training is also very important for us. Now with these commercial vehicles, NASA actually hands us over to SpaceX. And so we're getting into our suits. We're doing the checks on those suits to make sure there's no leaks. Then we walked out, we got into Teslas, and we rode out to the launch pad, which you'll see here. We're going to ride the elevator up, and we're here about almost 3 hours prior to launch is when we're crawling into the vehicle for the first time. We talked to SpaceX at their ground control station in California, and then the countdown comes, and I got to tell you, it's a pretty incredible moment. We actually had a night launch, and once it lights, it takes you about 9 minutes to get into space. You're going 17,500 miles an hour. There's a line that 100 kilometers. When you pass that mark, that's what we kind of call the edge of space. When you show up as a new astronaut, you go through basic astronaut training, and at the end of that, you get a silver astronaut pin. When you cross 100 kilometers, you're now a flown astronaut, and you get a gold astronaut pin. And so we were able to present Victor Ike with his gold astronaut pin right after we got on orbit. So that was a pretty special event. Here you can see we're coming in for the docking, and as we're coming in, it's an automatic docking, but we can take over and do it manually if we needed to. Once we dock, it's still going to take us a couple hours before you equalize the pressure between the hatches, and then you finally come in and you join the crew. On board, we actually had an astronaut and 2 cosmonauts that had come up on a Soyuz about 2 months prior to us. And then that's our home for the next 6 months, the International Space Station. So now let's see what we do. Let's go to the next slide. Why are we in the International Space Station? It's a national laboratory. We're there to do science. And that science covers a lot of different activities. It's physical science, it's biological science. Some of that science is on us. And so let's roll the video here. You're going to see Victor's working with a couple of satellites where they're flying information around station. We do a lot with plants. We do a lot in glove boxes because a lot of times you don't want the whatever it is you're working on to get out in the station. And then here you can see some of that work that's being done on us as the guinea pigs, if you will. Things like fire behave very differently in space. And so in this case, again, we've got it inside a glove box. The one you're going to see next is going to be kind of interesting. You're going to see some worms. And why would we have worms on board? Well, believe it or not, their muscles are very similar to our muscles. And so they can learn how their muscles weaken in space. And so that kind of gives us a hint of what's going to happen with ours. And that was a multi-generational experiment as well. So they went through, I think, about 4 generations of worms on board, which was pretty interesting. Fluids behave quite differently in space as well. And so you can see just one of the many experiments that we do that are involved with the fluids, because again, in the microgravity environment, they behave quite a bit differently than they do down here on Earth. All right, let's go to the next slide. One of the things we did get to do was grow a lot of plants while we were on board. It's kind of neat because the plants, we've been doing that for quite a few years now. And so they're starting to transition from it being just a purely experiment to something that's getting closer to being more operational. What do I mean by that? The early plant experiments, after they grew, they would harvest them and they'd have to send them all back home so they could do the analysis. So they never got to eat any of the plants. But now we actually are able to harvest them. Some of them we send home from analysis, but some of them they actually let us eat. And it was fantastic when you got to have some fresh produce, some fresh vegetables while you're on board station. Because again, most of the food that we eat while we're up there has been cooked 2 or 3 years prior. It's in this little package, dehydrated or irradiated. It's been stored on station for a year or so before you actually finally are eating it. So when you got to finally just cut something off of the stem and then eat it that night, that was pretty amazing. It's interesting, the psychological bonuses of being able to have that kind of food. When you bit into, like we have one of these is lettuce. And you could take that lettuce, you put like some chicken in it, a little sauce on it, and now you had a lettuce wrap. And when you bit into that and you got that crunch, that was just absolutely fantastic. You know, the other thing that's kind of interesting, your taste does change a little bit when you get up there, and used a lot more spices in space than I do down on Earth. One of the things that happens to us is you'll see a fluid shift. And so if you notice a lot of pictures of astronauts, their face will look like it's bloated a little bit. And what ends up happening then is you can kind of feel like your nose is clogged up, like you have allergies or something like that. So the taste isn't as strong, so you end up putting a lot of spices on there. And so when you got the fresh stuff, it just added something pretty special to it. Let's go to the next slide. I guess I need an explanation. So Baby Yoda, why do I have a picture with Baby Yoda? So there's a tradition that goes all the way back to Yuri Gagarin. When astronauts launch into space, inside their capsule, they will have what's called a zero-G indicator. And it's usually some kind of a soft plush doll. And what happens is when at 9 minutes, when the rocket shuts off and you're in space, you're floating, we're all strapped down, so we're not experiencing it. But your zero-G indicator is not, and so they're just attached to a string, and they start floating around the capsule, and that kind of indicates, okay, we're here, we made it, we're in the zero-G environment. So Baby Yoda was our zero-G indicator, and it was kind of fun because then just as we were up there for 166 days, and so just about every day we'd take a picture with Baby Yoda somewhere around station. Not all the plants that we grew while we were up there were for eating. And so this was kind of a personal experiment, if you will, where I actually brought up some sunflower seeds and was able to grow the sunflowers. And so that was kind of a neat experiment. It wasn't necessarily an official experiment. And so I kind of had it tucked away up here. And when I planted it, it was about that far from the light. And sunflowers can grow very fast. And so it grew right up to the light. So I had to move it off to the side to give it more room. And then it would just immediately turn and grow to the light again. And so that's why when you look at this stem, you can see all the changes in directions. That's as I was moving it. After it would get to the light, I'd move it, it would turn and kept turning. It got to be almost over 1 meter long before it finally bloomed. And it was not planned. Sometimes you get lucky. But this bloomed about 3 days before we came home. And so I actually was able to cut it off and I brought it back. And when I saw my wife for the first time, I was able to give her a flower that I'd grown in space. So that was pretty special. Let's go to the next. Let's go ahead and click on this. I talked about spacewalks. I've done a total of 5 spacewalks between my 2 missions, about 32 hours outside the space station in the vacuum of space. But it takes a lot of work to get your suits ready, the EMU, before you head out the door. And here you can see Shannon doing some of that work. And this will be days and weeks before a planned spacewalk. By the time we get to this point, where we're actually getting put into the airlock, we've already been working about 6 hours. It takes that long for us to get suited up, which is always kind of interesting because when you see the movies, right, and they're doing spacewalks, it takes them like 2 minutes to get in their suits, depress the airlock, and they're outside. It wouldn't make a very good movie if you just watched 6 hours of getting suited up, but this is your view. That does make a good movie. That's from a camera on our helmet as we're exiting the airlock. When you are outside, you're out there for anywhere from 6 to 7.5 hours is how much time you're working outside the space station. Here you can see Victor on the robotic arm. That's actually being controlled by the 2 astronauts inside. But again, just the views, just absolutely incredible. I can't say enough about what it's like to go out that hatch and to see the world without not looking through a window, right? You're looking at the world just through your visor, and it's a completely different perspective than looking at it through a window. While we're outside, and once you get in that suit, actually, the only thing you have is a little water bag. And so you get about 32 ounces of water or so. And that's it for about a 10-hour period. So you're usually, before you get suited up, you eat, you get as much calories in you as you can. You usually try and hydrate a little bit as well. But by the time you get out of the suit at the end of the day, you're pretty hungry, you're pretty dehydrated. It's been a tough day. Once we get in at the end of the spacewalk, it still takes us another couple hours just to get out of the suit, get them cleaned up, and get your tools put away and all of that. So it's a very long 16, 17 hour day for us when it's a spacewalk day. So pretty challenging, but I'll also tell you, it is one of the most rewarding things you could ever do. When you crawl back into that airlock and they call you up from the ground and say, hey, everything that you did, everything's working. It is just an amazing sense of accomplishment. You don't work the whole time. Let's go to the next slide. Sometimes you get to take some pictures. This picture actually is right before I got on that robotic arm to grab onto that pump module. Let's go to the next one. This was on my more recent mission. So if you want to get a sense of what it looks like through your visor, this is my visor here. And I'm actually taking a selfie like that, and you can see the reflection of the Earth. This is, you see this truss that's going down? That's one of our solar arrays. So I'm all the way out at the very edge of the space station. There's nothing, if I kept going, there's nothing to grab onto. So it's pretty neat being out there as well. Let's go to the next. So if you remember at the beginning, and when we got on station, you saw that there were 7 of us on board. We were the first time we had a 7-person crew. Prior to that, it was six people because we only came up on the Soyuz. So the SpaceX Crew Dragon, that allowed us to bring up that extra person. And the problem with that was we didn't have enough crew quarters. We only had 6 crew quarters. And so that meant we had to find somewhere for another one of us to sleep. And so I actually ended up sleeping in Crew Dragon Resilience that brought us up. That vehicle actually stays, the vehicle that brings you up stays docked to the station the whole time because it's your lifeboat. You know, like I talked about the training on emergencies that we do when we're on the ground. If any of those emergencies happen, a fire, a depress, an ammonia leak inside, we head right to our lifeboat. That's the first place we go. We make sure it's healthy, and then we start dealing with the emergency. But this also became my crew quarter. Not the best place for a crew quarter. Let's go to the next slide, Angel. The reason for that is you can see some of this orange, might be hard to see in the back, but this orange equipment there, that's our emergency equipment. So that's like emergency masks and oxygen and fire extinguishers and all of that kind of stuff. Well, this is my sleeping bag that I've got tied in there. And it's not really a good idea to have your sleeping bag covering up all of your emergency equipment if you get into that situation. So every day I was having to roll up my sleeping bag, keep all of my stuff in a location that it would be very easy to just kind of wrap it up and get it out of the way in case we had that emergency situation. But there was one advantage. If you notice right here, I've got the sunshade up, but I've got a couple of windows, and all the other crew quarters didn't have windows. So let's go to the next slide. And that was my view day after day after day. And it never got old. Let's go to the next slide. I tell you, the landscapes, the clouds, just absolutely amazing. You know, realize we're going around the earth 16 times a day. So 16 sunrises, 16 sunsets, and even the nighttime. Let's go to the next and roll the video. So this is the atmosphere. This is that 100 kilometers of atmosphere, the earth, and then you can see what the night sky looked like from my window. And again, just absolutely incredible to see that. I mean, it just felt like you could reach out and grab the stars. They were just right there and close to your hands. Let's go to the next. Yeah, so obviously very special, right? Those kind of events. But there's a lot of other things that are pretty special as well that we get to do. And one of those is they allow us to take some personal items up with us. About 1.5 kilograms of items get to go up. And so that's a big deal because it costs, I'll do it in pounds, you guys can do the math, but it's about $15,000 to $25,000 a pound to send something up to space. So for our 1.5 kilograms, you're talking about $70,000 to $75,000 that they're spending to let us bring personal items up with you to space. And so you want to choose items that are pretty meaningful to you. And I wanted to give you just a couple of examples of some things that I sent into space with me. The lower picture, that's a Purple Heart. We have some very close personal family friends that he was a Marine in World War II in the Pacific Theater. And so I was able to take one of his Purple Hearts up, and then I was able to present it to him afterwards. He's since passed away, but it was very special to be able to share that with him. The upper picture, this is my father's logbook. My dad was he was a Marine in the early 60s. He flew A4s, which is a single seat attack aircraft. And so he passed away in 2008, right before I was selected as an astronaut in 2009. And so I was able to take his logbook up with me, and I actually recorded my flight in his logbook. And then the story doesn't end there. I was actually able to, I have a son that's 24 years old now, and he's a second lieutenant in the Air Force going through pilot training. And so he's recorded his first flights in this logbook as well. So we have 3 generations of us that have recorded flights in this logbook that's been to space. So that was pretty special as well. You're up there for a lot of holidays. You know, when you're up there for 6 months, you do have holidays, and it's kind of neat. I will say I got a lot of bonus points for my Valentine to my wife on Valentine's Day. In fact, I think my son stole that and used that with their girlfriends too. But not all of the holidays are U.S. holidays, right? This is an International Space Station, and so we celebrate other countries' holidays as well. And so the upper picture here, this is actually the Russian Orthodox Christmas that's celebrated in January versus in December. And so that's one of the other kind of neat special things that you get to experience while you're in space, is not just, you're not just bringing your own culture up there, but your partners in the International Space Station are bringing their cultures up as well, and you get to share in that, which is pretty special. Let's go to the next slide. This was a pretty neat day for us. When we hit day 84 on orbit, we became the longest U.S. capsule to be in space. The previous one had been in 1973, 74 with the Skylab mission. And that's how long they had been in space, 84 days, and then they came back. And so on our day 84, we got to have a video conference with Dr. Gibson, who was one of the astronauts on that Skylab mission. So it was very neat being able to share the experience with him. It was amazing, quite frankly, the challenges of living in microgravity haven't changed in 50 years. And so some of the things that he experienced, we were still experiencing today. So another one of those pretty special days. Let's go to the next. Before you hit the video, let me talk a little bit on this. So NASA does an incredible job, absolutely incredible job of helping you stay in touch with your family while you're in space. We have the ability, we have an IP phone, so through our computer, I can put on the headsets and I can call anywhere in the States. I can get a call right now from the International Space Station on my cell phone. And so every night I would call my wife and my kids before I would go to bed. The other thing that you get to do is once a week, they do a video conference with your family. And so that's usually on the weekends when we have a little bit of time off. And so let's roll the video here. So on my first mission, my kids were playing.
I've been lacrosse and hockey.
Turn that down at
Yep.
all? Yeah, thanks. My kids played youth hockey, and there was about 4 or 5 times where a hockey game lined up with our video conference. And so this is my wife at the hockey rink holding the iPad, following the game. I'm watching it live as she's talking to me and giving me the play-by-play. And so I can't tell you how important these kind of moments are for you when you're isolated, when you're a bit disconnected from life down on Earth, because when you got to experience a little bit of what that life was like, what was going on Earth, it just made the rest of the week that much more achievable, right? You just were motivated to get through the week because you knew on the weekends you were going to get some moments like this. And so that's actually an important part of the missions. We actually, from a medical standpoint, we meet with a psychologist and a psychiatrist. They've been assigned to you every 2 weeks. We do a video conference with them. And they're there just monitoring our health, our mental health, to make sure everything's okay, that you're not getting stressed or getting tired or anything of that nature. And events like this help avoid those kind of situations. Let's go to the next. A couple other special events that happened on my latest mission. The first one is I've been in the Air Force for about 27 and a half years. And of course, we stood up the Space Force in 2019. And so while I was on board, I actually did a transition from the Air Force into the Space Force. So that was pretty special to get to do that. And then I mentioned my son, who's a second lieutenant now. I actually got to swear him in to the Air Force from space. And so this is me on the computer, and that's him actually taking the oath of office for the Air Force. And so that was pretty special. But then that wasn't enough. So after I splashed down, about a month afterwards, we were in San Diego in California on the beach, and I had to swear him in officially at that point. So that was again a pretty neat way to close things out. Let's go on to the next. Eventually, you got to come home though. And so after 6 months, it's time to come home. The 4 astronauts that you see in the back here, they're the ones that came up on the next Crew Dragon that are going to replace us. And, I do like to point out a few things on this. This is what we look like after 6 months inside a tin can without the sun or anything like that. And this is what you look like after 2 weeks in Florida getting ready to launch into space. So they got to spend a lot of time on the beach before they launched into space. Yeah, you do lose your tan in space. Let's go to the next, and you can roll it. So on dock day, it's an automatic undock. Again, we have the abilities to take over control manually if we had to. You're going to see this was a night splashdown. Here's the deorbit burn. And that's us streaking through the night sky taken from the International Space Station. It was a night splashdown. This was the first night splashdown since 1968 with one of the Apollos. And so this is with an IR camera. So that's us, and that's our parachutes that they open up about 2 kilometers above the Earth. And again, night splashdown, Gulf of Mexico. SpaceX was right there. About 35 minutes or so after we splashed down, they're hauling our capsule up onto the ship, the recovery ship. And then you can see you're pretty excited when you get back. Yeah, you're very excited, actually, as you can see. And go to the next slide. Big smiles on all of the crew. You know, this is your first breath of fresh air that you've had in 6 months, and so there is definitely one of the very interesting feelings that you get when you finally splash down is just this sense of, I don't have anything I need to worry about right now. Because for 6 months, you're always on duty. Even if we have a day off on a Sunday or something like that, you're still on duty. If anything goes wrong, an alarm sounds off, an emergency, if the ground calls up and says, hey, we need you to reboot this, you're always having to be on duty. And so for the first time in 6 months, and really, you know, it's a 2-year training process before most of this, most of the time that you launch. So for the last 2.5 years, you have been laser focused, you have been busy, and now you have no responsibility. None. And you can even see, you don't even have to get out of the vehicle by yourself if you don't want to. They're going to haul you out and hold you up and carry you to where you need to go. You don't even have to walk if you're not feeling like it. So it is a pretty incredible feeling at that moment, just to kind of, I'm done. And so pretty neat. Let's go to the next. What I'd like to do now actually is just answer as many questions as you have, as long as we have the time. When we're done with the questions, I've got just a few other stories I want to finish with before we close things out. So questions? Thank you. Thank you.
So what I wanted to ask is about your experience in college. So how did that play in college? And you were also an engineer. And the thing is, I'm also an athlete, and I want to know what the experience of balance
Right.
sport and an engineering career, your private life, social life,
Yeah.
and all things while aspiring to be something great like what to say.
Yeah, so that's a great question. And the key word you said there was balance, because you do have to balance all those things. I was actually, I don't know if you're familiar, but in the States, a lot of the universities, we have fraternities and sororities. And so I was a member of a fraternity, which is more of a social type of club, if you will. I was also in Air Force ROTC. But you have to set your priorities, right? And so my priorities were school. That's why I was there. Then it was ROTC, and then it was football, and then it was the fraternity, the social side of things. But when I say that was my priorities, that doesn't mean you can't adjust your priorities on a day-to-day basis, depending on what's going on. And so for me, Saturdays, that was football. That was a priority because we were playing our games on a Saturday. But for example, on Thursday, I would leave practice early because I had to do my ROTC. And so, you know, you're just kind of constantly shifting your priorities on a day-to-day basis, depending on what's going on. But you definitely need to make sure you have those kind of priorities. But then, as you said, just figure out the balance between those. And quite frankly, for me, being that busy in college made it a little bit easier because I didn't have that spare time that I could waste, if you will, right? So, you know, I'd get up, I'd have class from 8 until 1 or 2. I'd go over to the football stadium. I'd be there till about 7 at night, eat dinner. About 8 at night, you start studying until midnight. And then you go to bed and you wake up the next morning and do it all over again. And so it was very kind of a structured that helped me. Maybe it doesn't help everybody, but for me, I found it to be pretty useful. Yeah.
Hi. So my question is about
living in microgravity? And also, is everything horizontal oriented, or are you just working at
Yeah.
other astronauts?
That is a fantastic question. One of my crewmates on my first mission, I love the way he had described being in microgravity. And he said the impossible is possible in microgravity. And so that's why I could move around a 400 kilogram refrigerator all by myself in microgravity. On the other hand, it makes the simple things very challenging in microgravity. And so that living piece that you're talking about, you know, and I'll go there, going to the bathroom, right? Believe it or not, gravity helps. You don't realize how much gravity helps until you're up in space. So going, urinating, going pee, that one's pretty simple, right? We just have a tube that's got a cone on the end of it. You flip a switch on it, creates a fan, creates some suction, and then you just pee in it. And then we use the same cone for males and females. It works out, it's pretty easy, pretty quick. We do collect that urine, and then we recycle it. It becomes our drinking water. We recycle about 80%. But then when you have to go number two, when you have to, that gets more challenging. And so you actually, we put on a couple of nitrile gloves, the plastic gloves, you know, that you see doctors wearing. So you put on a couple of those. And we have a can that's about so big, that's got a seat on the top of it with a hole about that big around. And then there's a plastic kind of a bag in there that's got elastic around it so that, you know, it's sitting over that hole. And so you got a couple of foot restraints down there. You try and aim yourself appropriately. You do your business. Hopefully you've got good aim. But then when you're finished down here, gravity helps. And up there, you don't have that. And so that's why you've got the gloves on, because you then have to reach back and help things get to where they need to be. And then you do all the cleanup, take the gloves, put it all in the can. And so it's little things like that that are much more challenging in the microgravity environment. Just brushing your teeth or shaving is a big deal. And, you know, because you don't have a sink, you don't have, you know, so when you're shaving, you basically, you know, you wet your face, you put your shaving cream on, and then we have a disposable razor, and you go through one razor each time you shave, because it gets all clogged up and you don't have a way to rinse it out and get all the shaving cream and all that kind of stuff out of it. So it's pretty challenging to do those kind of things in the microgravity environment. But you get used to it as well. One last story I want to tell you about as well. And you asked about the orientation. We do orient the station. So we label the deck, we label the overhead, we have a port and we have a starboard. And you saw at the beginning, we were doing that training in the mock-up of the space station. And so, of course, there you're standing on the deck, you got the overhead, and that's how you end up doing a lot of your training like that. Well, in space, there's no up or down. And so we have equipment and experiments and all that kind of stuff that are on each of those surfaces. And so I was up there for my first week I was in space. And I had my job was to change out a microscope lens on one of our experiments. And so I'm sitting there, and I have, just like I had trained on the ground, I have my feet down at the deck, kind of locked into a handrail. And I'm trying to reach into this rack to change out this microscope lens, and my elbow's just not turning, you know, and I just can't get a good grip on it, and I'm struggling with it, and I'm struggling with it. And finally, one of the flight controllers calls up from the ground and says, "Mike, just flip upside down." And I did, and all of a sudden, I got easy access. My arm was in the right orientation. It took me 2 minutes to change the thing out. So it takes a while to kind of adapt to this environment where there is no up or down. And I think it would be fascinating to me to see someone that was born and grew up in a microgravity environment, because I suspect they would move and they would work in that environment much different than we do, because we're so used to having a 1G reference in everything that we do. Great question. Sure.
So first of all, it's such
Thank you. Ah. Yeah. 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 Another great question. Did you guys set these up? These are fantastic. So it is extremely important, the mental part of space flight. It is, so like our psychologists, we have both a psychologist and a psychiatrist that are assigned to you when you get assigned to a mission. And you actually meet with them multiple times throughout your training flow before you launch into space. And basically it's for them getting to know you, right? And being able to pick up when they're having your video conference with them every 2 weeks from on station, it really just is a conversation. And, you know, I'm just talking about what's going on, how the family is, those kind of things, but they're picking up the little things, right? And they'll pick up hey, these guys have been working like 20 straight days. We may need to give them a break because I'm starting to see some stress. I'm starting to see them looking tired. And so that's one of the things that's very, very important for us. The other thing that's interesting to me that I don't think we appreciate right now when we think about going to Mars. Our free time that we have on board the International Space Station, the majority of things that we are doing has to deal with Earth, right? I'm either calling my family, where there's no delay in that conversation. I'm watching videos of my kids play hockey. I'm taking pictures of Earth. Everything that we do in our free time is connected back to Earth. And so when you're going to Mars, you're not going to have that. You're not going to have the ability to pick up the phone and call because you're going to have multiple minutes of delay, right? You're not going to have that ability to take, I mean, it's just going to be black sky out there, if you will. So looking out the windows, you're not going to get to see the beautiful Earth on a day-to-day basis. And so I think that is going to present some challenges, some very serious challenges that we have to think about. One of the things that happens when we go to space now is I can't tell you how much training we have to go through before we launch. I mean, they want to train us on everything, and we have to do it multiple times, and we have to take tests and prove that we can do it and all of that kind of stuff. Well, when we go to Mars, I'm not sure if we shouldn't leave some of that training for that journey out to Mars, because we're going to need something to do. We're going to need something that's going to challenge our minds. And if all we're doing is just repeating some of the training that we've already done on the ground, well, it's not going to be as engaging. It's not going to be, I think, as mentally challenging. And so, you know, you got it. One of the worst things in space or anywhere else is if you give somebody too much idle time as well. So you want to stay busy. So I think what you're studying, what you're thinking about, those things are going to play probably a much larger role in the actual mission itself than what we talk about now. Right now we talk about big rockets and we talk about landers and we talk about all those kind of things that are absolutely necessary to go there. But it's those human pieces that I think are going to be pretty challenging and could make the missions, you know, that kind of balance between a very successful mission and one that has some issues. So thanks. Yeah. Good.
I was wondering if I could ask a bit about for someone that, like you, like from here in Colombia, aerospace.
Into aerospace or as an astronaut? Both.
Yeah.
Both. Yeah. Okay. You know, that's a good question, and I would say from you know, how in Colombia, I would say right now what I've seen. I've been in Colombia now for about 2 days, I think, maybe a little over 2 days. But you guys have a space work that is alive, is vibrant, and there's a lot happening in it right now. You've got a space operations center over in Cali that's going on. You sent 5 of your astronauts, analog astronauts, and they did a week in Poland where they were living in an isolated environment. And so there is a lot going on just in Colombia itself in terms of the space and having your own constellation of satellites up there. And I think there's a lot of interest in someday having your own astronauts as well that are going up into space. And that's, I got to tell you, that's an exciting time right now, right? This SpaceX vehicle that I rode up on, 4 months after we splashed down, 4 private citizens took it up into space for 3 days. And so there are more and more opportunities for other countries to have their own missions in space as well through these private companies like this commercialization of space. I will also tell you that we have people from all over the world that come and work with NASA as well. Columbia has signed on to the Artemis Accords. Is everybody familiar with what Artemis is? So Artemis is the program that for us to go back to the moon and then on to Mars. And we're not going to be able to do that without partners, without a lot of our international partners. And so Columbia has actually signed on to that agreement as well for the Artemis Accords. So I think there's a lot of opportunities that are in the next 10, 15 years you're going to find here in Columbia itself to either support human spaceflight or control satellites or help build satellites. It's all going to be right here, which is exciting. Okay.
If you could do an advice for people like both of us who really aspire and dream to be up there and
So what I would tell you, first off is it's fantastic that you have that dream. I've actually had an opportunity to sit on a couple of selection boards for astronauts. And we had one of the people we interviewed was from, I can't remember which country, but a South American country that had come to the US and become a citizen. And I remember when she was talking about wanting to be an astronaut, and she said when she was little, she didn't even know she could dream to be an astronaut, right? It wasn't, and that really struck me because when I grew up on a farm in Missouri in the middle of the United States. I didn't know anything about space. I didn't, but at the same time, as I grew up and I knew about it, there was no limits on what I could dream. And here was a person that didn't even realize they could dream about going into space. And so I think you've got the first step right now is you've got that dream, right? And that's the first thing that needs to happen to be able to someday go into space. The second thing I would tell you is there's a lot of ways to participate in the human space flight other than just being an astronaut. It takes tens of thousands of people to send one astronaut into space. And so, contributing in the aerospace industry, contributing in the space economy and human space flight, there's a lot of ways to do that. But the way we oftentimes will describe what you need to do, if this is an interest of yours, one, you have to always pursue something that you're passionate about. That if you make a career choice because you think that's what's going to get you to be an astronaut, but it's not something that you're necessarily passionate about, it's going to come out. People are going to realize that, and it's probably not going to, at the end of the day, help you become an astronaut, and then you're doing something that you didn't really want to do. So we always tell people you got to find something that you're passionate about, that you love, because astronauts come from all walks of life in the US. I mean, we've got pilots, we've got engineers, we've got physicists, scientists, microbiologists, doctors, submariners, Navy SEALs. I mean, you name it, we come from all walks of life, but each one of those people were in that career field because they loved that career field. And then they just had the advantage of getting to then become an astronaut. So do something that you're passionate about. Second thing is for us, or the next thing for us, at least in the US, with the agencies, NASA or ESA or CSA, you have to be in a STEM field. And STEM fields are hard. And so you got to just accept that it's going to be hard work. My first physics test in college, I got a D. And I think they were generous. I don't know if I deserved a D or not. So I really had to buckle down and figure out physics. I mean, it didn't come easy for me. And so that's just something you got to accept, that it's going to be hard work to get through these very technical career fields. The next thing is you're going to be a lifelong learner. You just got to accept that I'm always learning. I've gone to space twice. I've spent almost a year in space. I'm 53 years old and I'm still learning. And, before you're still taking tests, you're still getting You're getting evaluated in everything that we do. So you just got to accept in your mind that you're going to be a lifelong learner. And then the last one, and this is probably the most important one, is that you got to be a great teammate. And so I kind of alluded to the fact that there's a lot of ways to contribute to human spaceflight. If you, when you focus on teammates, if you're thinking just between the astronauts themselves, you got it wrong. Those tens of thousands of people that are helping contribute to get you there, they're as much a part of the team as you are as the astronaut. You wouldn't get to go do what you do in space if it wasn't for each and every one of them. And so you need to recognize that and be a good team player. So if you do those kind of things, at least you have a chance. You're welcome. Where are we?
First of all, what's the process that NASA follows, like, assemble? Because the first thing that you talk about is like how much confidence you have experience.
Yeah.
So I think that that's important.
Yeah.
I can trust.
Yeah. Okay. So a couple things. The way we assign crews, the chief of the astronaut office, who's an astronaut, they are the ones that get to do that. And so I think if you ask most astronauts, we'd say, I don't know how they do it. But they do need to take a look at some of the different skill sets that, oftentimes there are advantages to having a crew that has some that have had experience already, but you need to get other people experience. So I think it's always good to have a mixed crew in that respect, some that have flown before, some that haven't flown before. And then the other thing that, I mentioned having a pilot there with me as the commander, as an engineer, complementary skill sets. And so I think that's important as well. Sometimes we have restrictions that we have to do because of things like spacewalks. Everybody has to be, we have to have a certain number of people on board that are qualified to do spacewalks, and it's challenging to get qualified to do a spacewalk. One of the things that you do in the training in that pool is you can be as far away from the airlock as possible, and they'll call an emergency where your crewmate outside has gone non-responsive, and so you've got to haul them back in, and you've got 30 minutes to do that. And if you can't pass that test, you're not going to get EVA qualified. And like I said, it is challenging, and not everybody gets that qualification. So we always have to make sure that we've got people on board that can do those spacewalks. And sometimes that can be a limiting factor as well as to what the crew. And then the other thing that happens is, like you saw our crew with Soichi on board, that was Japan's choice. They had a seat, and Japan got to decide who they wanted to put on that crew. And so that's often in fact, I don't know if you guys saw that we just had a launch yesterday, right? And they're docking with the space station today. Crew 5 just launched. It had a Marine on board as the commander, a Navy commander on board as the pilot, but then it had a Japanese astronaut and a Russian cosmonaut on board. And so the Japanese astronaut and the cosmonaut came from, the decision was from their industries. So we don't have to have, we don't have to have a medical doctor on every crew, because we all get some training in emergency aid and things of that nature. I think when we go to Mars, that might be a different story, right? When you're going that far out, you're going to need that professional medical trained person to be able to handle some of the more challenging emergencies you might have. But anyway, not a great answer. It's a little bit fuzzy for most of us on how the crews are decided. You had a second question? Okay, well, we got a lot of questions, sure. Okay, so what happens to us when we come back? We spent 6 months up in space. Some of us, we've had astronauts that have been up there a year. What are some of the impacts to your body when you get back? One of the things that you can have is you can lose bone mass. So we can lose up to 2.5% bone density in a month. And that's why we exercise when we're on board. We exercise for about 2 hours a day, and that helps keep your bones strong. But you still end up, like on my last mission, I ended up losing about 7% bone density in kind of my core area. What's interesting about that, you talk about the long-term effects of that. It can take years for you to get that bone density back. And it doesn't always come back in the same proportions, right? Your bone's got that honeycomb type inner portion and the hard outer, and it doesn't come back in the same percentages between those two. And so one of the things that happens to us after you've flown in space is you become an experiment basically for the rest of your life. Because they want to see, as we get older, do we have more instances of broken bones? Do we have more instances of cancer because of the radiation that we're exposed to? Some of the other things that will happen is think about what your heart's doing right now, right? It's having to overcome gravity to keep blood up into your head and keep it circulating around, right? Well, in space, it doesn't have to work that hard, right? So your heart can actually get a little bit smaller, right? It's not having to, and so that's why you'll see, you noticed when I got out of the capsule, there were two people right there, because when you stand up, your heart might not keep up, it might not keep the blood going to your head, and you could pass out. And so those are some of the things that can take time to get back. Some of the other things that'll happen, you know, we exercise on board, so our muscles are just as strong as they were before, but your mind has forgotten how much things weigh. And so your mind doesn't know how much force do I need to tell my arm to pick up this water bottle? Because when you first come back, this thing feels like it weighs 100 pounds. And your arm will be shaking just picking that up. Your stability is all messed up. So, you know, we've got that inner ear that uses gravity to help us stay balanced down here on Earth. Well, for 6 months, it hasn't been doing, you know, hadn't had to do anything because there's no up or down. So when it gets back into the gravity environment, man, it feels weird. And if you notice, like when I don't know if you noticed, when I stepped out of the capsule, I was kind of, you know, very, very unstable. And that can last weeks before you really get that stability back. I got to tell you, one of the things that I wish we did a better job of, we don't like to show some of the impacts, particularly in those first 24 hours for astronauts after they get back from space. You don't see a lot of videos of that. Quite frankly, that's those 24 hours suck. It's a hard 24 hours. You can be nauseous, you're unstable, it's hard to sleep. It's just it's a tough time. And so those kind of things we got to take into account when, you know, if one of you are going to step on Mars someday, you're not going to have that person there ready to catch you if you should pass out. So what are we going to have to do when someone lands on Mars for the first time? Do we need to give them 2 days before we plan that first walk outside, just to give their body time to recover? Those are some of the challenges with coming back to gravity environments.
What is the process that somebody needs to go through?
The process that someone needs to go through. So in the United States, every 3-4 years, we have applications. We put out a call for a new class. And so what ends up happening is all of those applications will come in. It's, gosh, we had one year, we had 18,000 applications come in. And so what we will do, you know, we've got a minimum requirements. That 18,000, there was probably, I don't know, I think it was like 7,000 or 8,000 that didn't even meet the minimum quals. So those were easy. You were able just to not look at those. And then the rest of them, we try and have an astronaut look at every one of those applications. And so we'll take those applications, we'll look at them all, and we'll put them in a group of what we call highly qualified astronauts. And so then we'll go out and we'll ask for their reference. And usually that's about 400 or so of the applicants. So we've gone from 10,000 down to about 4,000 or 400, where we'll ask for their references. And then out of those 400, we'll ask about 120 or so of them will come in for, they'll come in for a 3-day trip to NASA, Johnson Space Center in Houston. And during that trip, we'll have an interview with them. And it's gonna tell you, it's an intense hour, because it's you sitting at the end of a table, and around you are 10 astronauts throwing questions at you. And so then out of that, we'll take probably 40 or so, and we'll bring them back for a second round of interviews. That's going to be a whole week long. And in that one, we're giving you another one of those interviews. But then we're also doing things like we'll put a group of you and we'll give you a challenge that, hey, you've got this board and this rope and you've got to get across a river. How are you going to do it? Because we want to see how you interact in a team. And then one of the other things that we do during that week is we're going to have some type of a social event, because we want to see how you just interact with people in a more natural environment, because those things are important, particularly when you're going to, when you're going to be spending months at a time with them in a very closed environment. And then from there, we make our selections. So it's a challenging, long process that we go through in the States to select an astronaut.
That's what.
Okay.
Because you want to share.
Yep, I got. Okay. Oh wow. Yeah, man, that's a big question. What's the most positive way that space has impacted life here on Earth? Gosh, I don't know if I could just say one thing, right? I mean, it's I would say a couple things. I think we are meant to explore. I think it's just in our human nature that we want to do that. And so that exploration that we're talking about, that going into space and having those experiences, I think it's something we can all relate to. And I think it's that inspiration, right? And so if you're going to say one thing that had impacts, think about all of the people that have decided to go into engineering, have decided to go into the sciences because of what they have seen people getting to do in outer space. And so it's that getting the next generation inspired, because it may not even be space, right? You may become a scientist just because you got to see some experiments in the space station, but then you might find that cure for cancer, right? I mean, that's a pretty big impact from just the inspiration that you got from watching human space flight. So I mean, I bet you could, gosh, you could probably just list 100, 1,000 different things that have benefited life down here on Earth. And some of them are simple. I talked about the bone loss and the things that we do to counter that in space. Well, if you think about it, that happens to us down here on Earth as we age. And so we're constantly finding ways that we need to overcome things in the microgravity environment, apply to life down here on Earth as we get older. And so the list is very long, but that's, I was saying the other day, wow, I've been here for, like I said, 2.5 days. I've done a lot of talks over my last 13 years as an astronaut, and I still get asked questions that I've never heard before. And that was definitely one of them. So thank you for that. I'll have to really think about that one a little bit more too. That's great. Okay, can we go back to the slides? Is that possible? You make that happen, Angel? Okay, and let's go to here. I started out with a story on fear, and there was that, that kind of scared fear that I shared, but there's also that anxiety type of fear that you can have as well. You got a big exam. One of the other examples with space flight is when you're coming back into land, you're coming through the atmosphere, you enter the atmosphere at 100 kilometers, you're going all the way through, free falling until 2 kilometers when those chutes open up. So if you can imagine, you're pretty anxious about that moment in time, because if those chutes don't open at that 2 kilometer point, you don't have a lot of time left before you're going to smack down into the water, and that's going to be it. So that's kind of that anxiety fear. So how do you deal with that? Preparation. I don't know if any of you have watched there's a film out there called Solo, and it's a guy that climbed without ropes. He climbed one of the famous El Capitan in the United States. And when you see that film, the amount of preparation that he did to climb that is unbelievable. And so when you're prepared, it helps you deal with those moments where you might have some anxiety or some fear. And I think anybody here in the military certainly can relate to that, right? I mean, we do a ton of training as military members as well. Another way that helps me with those moments, and let's go to the next, Angel, if you could, is my family. My family has been a part of this whole journey. My wife and I actually started dating in college, When I told her that I wanted to be an astronaut, she laughed at me because she thought that was only what little kids wanted to do. But the reality is she's been with me through the whole experience, and my kids have been with me through the whole experience as an astronaut as well. And so just knowing that they're a part of that, and they support me and help me through those moments is another way that I deal with it. And then the last way, and let's go to the next, I converted to Catholicism right before my first flight in 2012. My wife's Catholic, my sons have been raised Catholic. I was raised Methodist, but I just felt like something was missing, and it was my relationship with God. And so I converted to Catholicism, and I was able to take the Eucharist up with me. And so on a weekly basis, I received communion. Before I went out on my spacewalks, I received communion. And so when I launched and I landed, this is, if you're not familiar, this is a pyx, which is a little container that has the body of Christ in it. And so when I launched and I landed in space, I actually had Jesus with me in my pocket of my spacesuit. And so that's one of those other things that just helped me deal with that moment. I didn't need to be afraid because I had Jesus with me. And so there's a lot of different ways that you can deal with the fears. I think each of you will find your own way. But this was just one of those ways that I did. So thank you very much. Great questions. I tell you, this was fantastic. I love to see the enthusiasm for space. And so good luck with all of your careers and your studies and everything else. Thank you very much.